One of the things I've been wanting to do today is watch another OCG player discussion video from Sunny. And I suppose, I mean, now is as good as ever because there seems to be a longer break coming up for YCS Houston. So let's jump in. We've got why OCG players love Dragon Tail, which is just another iteration in the series where we started watching this, or we watched a video last week about the OCG current state and why Yummy hasn't been as good as we thought. And currently, it looks like Dragon Tail is the deck for them out of the new deck building pack. And this is a video further talking about this. Now, just for some context, because not everyone here might be familiar with the OCG format or the stuff that is about to come out, Dragon Tail is an archetype that revolves around fusion monsters. And their main gimmick is that one of the two spells, I don't know which one, I think the right one, is a fusion spell that lets you take the materials from the deck. So it's basically a branded fusion. But the twist to it is that all the fusion monsters for the deck require one monster from your hand. So you cannot actually use both monsters from the deck. You have to use one from your hand and one from your deck. The left one apparently is the one. I'm being corrected. So that's the gimmick, and then a bunch of, they have like, I think all of them or most of them, if they're sent to the graveyard as fusion material, they get you the trap cards from your deck. So they set up trap cards from your deck, and the trap cards have a pretty cool feature where they put each other back to the bottom of the deck. So you only play one of the trap cards, but they keep recycling and you keep getting them back. Which seems pretty cool as a concept. But let's hear from an OCG player who's had some experience with this. Hold up.
OCG players are, regardless of region, typically saying that Dragon Tail will be one of the strongest decks next format. Even on release, by the time I got to locals, people were already saying that Dragon Tail was the strongest of the new decks. So let's talk about why. I'll start by giving an overview of the deck, then discussing strengths and weaknesses. I won't be discussing different builds in this video, there are just too many. The most popular one is a King of the Swamp build with Polymerization and Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, and that's the one I'll mostly be referring to, but there are also Regenesis, Shaddoll, Magistus, or Fight for Package builds. I'm personally playing a pure version with the K9 Hand Trap package, so just know that they exist, but I won't be going over them in this video. If I were to use words to describe what Dragon Tail does, it would sound bad because it is a very unique deck. The engine is large, there's quite a decent number of bricks, and the plays also require a large number of cards. There is a choke point for hand traps, and it has a lot
that does not sound very tempting.
Of qualities that recent good decks don't have. In recent formats, all of the best decks have taken one card and produced a lot from that one card. Dragon Tail doesn't do that. Dragon Tail uses a lot of cards to make things, but it does so in very few actions. That is, in my opinion, one of the greatest strengths of Dragon Tail.
You see, that's also, not only might that, they're saying that's a strength of the deck, but that is also something that I personally find very desirable for Yu-Gi-Oh decks. I do feel like if 2024 has done one thing for Yu-Gi-Oh, it has established like this standard that every Yu-Gi-Oh deck has to do a lot off of just one card. And that is something that we're kind of holding up most decks to this standard by now. We're like, oh, just like one card combos and stuff. What does it do with just one card and stuff like that? It's not something that I particularly like in a deck or in design when every deck just has a bunch of one card combos. So I think the way you get out of this sort of like rabbit hole where every deck needs to do one card combos is you have to print good decks that are not like that and slowly phase out all the one card combo stuff. Not all of it. Like Yu-Gi-Oh is at a state where we're not getting rid of all of the one card combos, you know, like, so, and some one card combos are to be expected and are fine, but I do want more Yu-Gi-Oh decks to function like this, where you can play like heavy engine and produce something out of multiple cards. But of course, in order for that to work, you need those decks to be viable compared to the one card combo stuff. So you need to tone down what decks can do with like one card and stuff like that. So, but this seems like a good thing to me. If this sort of deck is viable in the OCG, that's a good sign.
The deck is deceptively explosive. Explosive might not be the right word, but there have been decks in the past that accomplished their board in very few summons. Think Voiceless, for example. You know, Barrier, search Saphira, Saphira, dump and add, banish, summon Skull Guardian affect the search, but Dragon Tail is really the first deck, I'd say, where you can make a reasonable board quite literally from doing one thing. I'm not saying the deck only does one thing on their turn, by the way. Most of the time,
I mean, but yeah, if you think about it, you activate the fusion spell, right? You activate the fusion spell, you fuse 2 Dragon Tails into a Dragon Tail fusion. Both of the monsters in the graveyard trigger, so you get both of your trap cards, and you're essentially done, right? Like, you can maybe keep going if your hand produces more stuff, but you will be fine even if you're under Maxi or Fuva or whatever like that. You can completely add, you can end on that. That's fine.
it's 3 things if you're not counting resolving triggers. It's usually like 1 search and 2 fusions, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on hand traps and interrupts. So why does that matter? Well, there are 2 main factors, I'd say. The first one is how interactable the main action is, and the second is the deck's ability to compromise. Regarding the first point about how interactable the main action is, this again comes in 2 parts. The first is whether you can stop the board setup from the action, and the second is whether or not you can actually stop the action. Stopping the board setup is easy to answer. You can't really. The effects trigger in the graveyard and place the cards on field, not add, which means you can't ash them. The only real way to stop them are if you play the 1-1 Gamma Driver ratio, or if you play the K9 package and Ripper negate them. Stopping the actual fusion is a lot more difficult to answer. In short, you can stop most of the ways to fuse with Ash or Imperm, but you can't stop all of them. And
I did ask that question like last week when we were talking about this. What makes fusion decks like so good going second in general? Because a lot of fusion decks just tend to be like, I have a lot of engine, I don't play a lot of hand traps. I mean, some decks do, but like typically fusion engines are considered quite strong into boards. And that's just because I think they function a lot. They have very powerful spell cards and they're very hard to interact with. And they tend to have a lot of graveyard effects too, because that is one of the signs of good fusion strategies these days, is that usually you don't want to fuse and lose the cards. So most of the cards have graveyard effects. So they're like fine into a lot of interaction, especially in the OCG right now where Dweller is already banned. It's like, if you go first into this sort of deck, it's not easy to stop a lot of these things.
they only need to resolve one of them to make a board. There are 3 ways to fuse going first, 4 ways to fuse going second, unless they're on a King of the Swamp build with polymerization, in which case there is 1 additional way to fuse. 3 of these ways are interactable, both the spell cards are ashable, and the Cartesia is stoppable with effect negation. But Phimeta is not, except by dominant.
Quick effect, discard, fusion by using monsters from hand or field. Okay, so there's like multiple ways to fuse. Some of them can be ashed, but some of them can't be, so they can play around it.
Impulse, which can only be played by Malice or Orchist because it is basically just polymerization. And they have a lot of rotas, so it's hard to stop them from even getting to this card, even if they don't hard draw it, unless you drew both Ash and Imperm. And most importantly, they only need to successfully fuse 1 time to make their board. Let's take another fusion deck, such as Memento for example. That deck wants to make 2 fusions every time, and they only have 2 fusion cards, which means that negating 1 stops access to one of their 2 fusions. This deck really only needs to fusion 1 time to make competent interrupts, and they have 4 to 5 cards that can fuse, which means they have a degree of redundancy that makes it hard to completely stop. The second reason that the explosiveness matters is compromise. If you're going to be getting a lot from accomplishing 1 thing, that means that blowout hand traps, except for Shifter and Retaliating Sea, are going to do a lot less to your deck because you can just stop after the first action and have something pretty good. Retaliating Sea is looking like the side deck card of the format based on its impact against the new decks. So that is going to be...
Memento is okay with just making Creation King? Yes, but what they're saying is true. Like, Memento has a limited amount of ways to get into their fusion stuff, which is sometimes important to even get to the Creation King. So if you are able to stop one of their ways to fuse, there is a chance they won't be able to fuse at all, which will stop a significant portion of their combos. And so what they're saying is for this deck, it has a nice balance or even an overabundance of fusion, like ways to summon fusion monsters, because you only, like, if your goal is to fusion summon once or twice, but you have like 5 ways to do it, it is very likely that one of those ways is going to be available to you and resolve. Because let's say they ash one of your fusion spells, you still have other ways to fall back on, which is neat, right?
A problem that will come up, but everything else is easy to play into. Maxi and Foolos have just become Upstart Goblin. The deck rarely special summons outside of the extra deck, so Molcharmies are -1 except for Foolos. Droll isn't going to do much, and Nib won't even be activatable. So individually, Most of the cards don't read insane at all. It's mostly just a series of fine cards that forms a unique deck identity. There are really only 2 individual cards that feel very strong to me. The first one is 5 mana. It's a quick effect polymerization that you can use during the main phase, which means that it gives you turn 0 plays by letting you fuse for bounces on their turn, while also setting up follow-up. If you use the bricks to fuse, you also get effect negation or pops as well. To me, if I just read the card, I think a searchable quick effect polymerization alone would be playable. Actually, I know it's playable because both Chimera Fusion and Memento Fusion are playable, but this card also doubles as fusion material, which means its flexibility reduces the brick hands of the deck a lot. The other card that I would say individually reads pretty insane is the Fusion, Arizarion. It bounces monsters on the field or graveyard back to hand based on number of materials used from the hand, and this does a couple of things. First is that it disrupts your opponent's graveyard. Obviously, it's not always good to return things in your opponent's graveyard to their hand. This would do nothing to the Canine Wolf, for example.
It's just a very efficient fusion monster, right?
But it does sometimes disrupt them. It also recycles your fusion materials, which is very useful most of the time because if you use 5 mana to fuse, you haven't used her material effect to place yet. And it also lets you guarantee victory in games because if you hand trap them, then you can return the hand trap and basically lock them into infinite Tsukiyomi. It doesn't even have to be recycling Maxi if they couldn't pass the first.
The more I hear about this deck, the more I think it's very powerful, but the more I also feel like I like the design behind it because I think it's like less steps is good for Yu-Gi-Oh in a lot of ways because sometimes I wish these combo decks just like, let's say you're okay with a combo deck having a strong end board. Sometimes it still feels like the steps it takes to get there are just like so many and so unnecessary. It's just like, just get to the point, man. You know, like if you want to make a good card or a good combo, just make it good without making it like this card searches that card, that searches that card, that gets that card, that summons that card. So it's like, yeah, this sounds cool to me.
Ash, then they definitely won't pass the second one behind the board. It's also obviously a board breaker that is easily chain blockable. So to summarize, the deck has many strengths. The first is that the deck consistently makes something in a lot of games. It's really hard to...
I will say, with this sort of deck, I do believe that it is not only about the strength of the deck itself, it is also about the environment that it's being put in. What I mean by that is that this appears to be a deck that plays off of multiple card combos with heavy engine. You know, like this is a deck that has a lot of engine in it, and it is good at that because the engine is very hard to stop from doing its thing, apparently. But you do have to mention that there are certain formats where a deck with very high engine count is not super good. You know, like you do need an environment where a deck off of a lot of engine can work. There is formats where decks with a lot of engine just don't play very well going second. Like if this was being thrown into a format where the decks going first make like 5 negates or something, then I think it'd be much harder to actually pilot, which is not the case in the current format over in the OCG as well. Like even for us in the TCG, it's not the case. Decks are powerful, but they don't do super, like they don't like make infinite negates and stuff like that. Like imagine a format where in the OCG they still have Toad and Mermail is the best deck. Against Mermail, I don't think this deck would fare very well because they go second. And like in the TCG, for example, if Mermail was the best deck, a deck like this would not stand a chance going second because it's like, yeah, hand rip Mooling Glacier for 2, summon Barrier Statue or summon double Toad or whatever. Like you wouldn't beat this with an engine heavy deck, right? And like, yeah. There, White Forest does all the things you're saying. Yeah, but White Forest is nowhere near the top contender. Like, it's fine. It's maybe in the top 5 or 6, but the other decks are way more popular than White Forest. So yes, if White Forest was the most represented deck in the OCG, this type of deck might not be good enough. It might not cut it.
To stop them from making any interrupts, and the deck also has follow-up. The second is that it's a deck that has extremely strong compromises under most blowout hand traps, except for Shifter and Retaliating Sea. The third is that it has an engine that can function going second. Personally, I've been having a hard time winning going second, but I'm fairly certain that's due to pilot error because the deck itself has the qualities of a deck that can function going second. Since it has removal, both targeting and non-targeting, as well as negates with chain blocking capabilities. The fourth is that it can play on its opponent's turn if they open 5 mana, and the bounces are a very strong interrupt. Older decks are just not designed to be able to handle getting multiple monsters bounced back to the extra deck, or into their hand. But it's also not a deck without clear weaknesses either. The first is that it is not a 1-card starter deck. That doesn't really matter too much in the context of raw brick percentage in my opinion, because if I'm being honest, the deck is fairly consistent, especially because the second card you need is so generic, but it does matter in the context of needing a lot more cards to duo play. So it sometimes becomes awkward if you have to use your cards such as hand traps to disrupt them, or if they push through your initial setup. The second is that the deck itself is also not immune to hand traps the way a deck like Yummy is. Hand traps, even if used in a suboptimal spot, do something against the deck. An easy way to explain this is by going over an average Dragon Tail turn. The issue is that unless their hand is extremely strong, they're going to have to make a bounce fusion first.
Oh,
this is because the Dragon Tail player has cards that float, but no matter what, in order to do plays, you're going to have monsters in hand. So the monsters float, but they float into extenders or disruptions. That's why you can't afford to just fuse away your monsters and not recover them, which is why you almost always make this fusion first. There are not many hands that can start with a different fusion. Unfortunately, this also means that your most important choke point is first, and that also means it's very difficult to bait interrupts with a different card, and also quite uncomfortable to get hand trapped here. Sometimes you don't get hit here, you get hit on your normal summon, which you commit before this, whether that be the Stratos or the Cartesia.
Okay, so what they're saying is you go into the one, this is the one that adds back monsters from your graveyard to your hand, right? Equal to the number of cards you used from your hand. So you, if they imperm you there, they haven't stopped you completely, but they do stop like your firewall stuff, your follow up.
But this is not a good play for your opponent most of the time. Both can be good to interact with, but they have their own problems. Stopping Yugioh can stop the 5 mana ad, but they have 6 Rotas, so it's 9 copies of 5 mana, which means a lot of the time, it's not good to stop the search unless you can also stop the bounces. Sometimes the opponent's logic is also praying that the Dragon Tail player doesn't have a second Dragon Tail monster, so they won't float on the second material. But the engine is so large that's rarely the case. Still, unlike Yummy, if you deny this first search, even if they have a way to fuse in their hand, they're going to get denied a Dragon Tail material eventually unless their hand is all engine. Stopping Mururu also has problems, but it also has advantages as well.
During the main phase, fusion summon a Dragon Tail. Cannot special summon except fusions. If this card sends to the grave, set a Dragon Tail. Okay.
It leaves them with a fusion for your turn, but it stops the placement of both traps, so it doesn't do nothing even though you do leave them with a quick effect fusion on your turn. The main reason—
Well, stopping this one seems risky, because what if they have another way to fuse? Then you just wasted your imperm, I suppose.
Reasons players are hand trapping the normal is because their hand is not strong enough to beat the 2 traps. If they can't beat the 2 traps, then they're going to need to hand trap the starter and hope the Dragon Tail player bricks. The other solution is if they open multiple hand traps. If they have 2 imperms, then you can imperm the normal and the fusion, or if you have an imperm and an Ash Blossom.
What was the trap card's effects again? Was it like, was it an imperm and a bounce or something? I'm pretty sure one of them was a bounce. Oh, negate a spell and a bounce. Ooh, that's pretty good.
Then it's decently safe to Ash as well.
Spell negate
the
is
deck
pretty
doesn't
good.
really push through both an imperm and an Ash Blossom that often. The third weakness of the deck is that their follow-up is left on field, not in their hand. Recently, Konami has started adding a bunch of these place effects instead of search, which interacts better with Droll and Ash Blossom. However, placing is not objectively better than searching. It loses to removal, for example, which means that if your opponent manages to push past your board, they can start popping your follow-up. Of course,
this is particularly good because I was about to say something like Duster or Lightning Storm seems good against this deck. But they do have a spell negate for it apparently. How good is it into evenly matched? It seems like evenly matched would be quite good, unless the card, you said spell, is it spell and trap or just spell? Because you said spell. Just spell? Evenly doesn't seem bad then, right? Because then you also, it's very important, you lose the trap cards forever because they're banished face down unless you keep one of them. You have 3 mana in hand still? Yeah, but once again, losing one of the 2 traps forever is pretty annoying, isn't it? Because you also lose the recursion then.
Of course, the traps are going to be useful. You can bounce yourself with a trap and draw 1, but it's not as safe as other decks follow-up, especially because this deck needs additional cards in hand to even start making plays. And then finally, this last one doesn't seem like it matters, but it comes up a lot more than it might seem. If for whatever reason you lose both traps, then you basically have no board on the next turn, and it's not that hard to lose both of them because both are interruptible by Ash or Bell. So if they have any non-targeting destruction, or if they stop the second...
You know, this just feels like to me a deck that is very good but has reasonable downsides. Which is like, I feel like I'm celebrating them for the bare minimum right now, but it just feels nice. It just feels nice to have a deck that you look at. I'm like, yeah, I want to play that. That seems cool, but it seems fair. You know, it's a good thing, but I feel like I'm just celebrating the bare minimum right now after what 2024 has done.
And trap somehow, then you're kind of cooked for the next turn, unless you find a way to kill them, or they have nothing left either. I think in terms of actual game design, Konami has been moving in positive directions since Crossover Breaker. More decks are playable on their opponent's turn with Engine.
Reasonable downside is not strong enough for a tier 0 format, unfortunately. Yeah, but that's not what we're in, fortunately.
We're moving away from lingering floodgates, except for
OCG right now.
I personally think are net positive for the game. There's less shifter, there's less roll, there's less maxi, there's less decks with 1-card combos, and we're moving more towards multiple card combos, which requires a larger engine. Decks are capable of consistently making boards through hand traps without invalidating them. They're having a bigger focus on placing effects that are interactable with removal. That's just my opinion. Maybe you think these choices are bad, but I personally like them. And at the very least, I think it's very interesting that there's a clear shift in card design philosophy. Just to end off, I'm trying to word this very innocuously, but I'm not saying Dragon Tail is better than Yummy, or Yummy is better than Dragon Tail, or any deck is better than a new deck. I know these topics are quite sensitive for some people. I try to be very conservative with these things right when a new format starts, especially because the truth of the matter is...
Who is this YouTuber? I can actually... Oh, that's a good point. I haven't linked you the thingy yet. There you go. It's Sunny. Their name is Sunny. They're an OCG duelist, and they make OCG content, and I really like...
And I don't think the answer to that question matters that much.
At it.
I think too often people talk about which decks are better than other decks.
Link
and
is
in my
in chat
opinion,
right now.
It's a lot more useful to talk about what each deck does specifically and what situations it struggles in or performs well in.
Did you hear that Farfa is a stun Andy now? I heard, yeah. He told me on the podcast already. I don't know if the podcast is out yet, but it's already been recorded and he told me about it. So yes, I know.
Now, I'm not saying that if someone says X deck is better than another, that means that I think they're saying useless things. Most of the time when someone says that, they've already spent time to figure out when a deck is good and what its strengths and weaknesses and matchups are.
He's 100% correct with his take. I agree. With the things he said about this deck looking healthy for the game and the design shift being interesting and good, I agree with it. I would think the majority of the community agrees to it. I hope so, but I'm not speaking for the entire community. But I personally agree as well that this sort of design looks a lot more healthy than a lot of stuff we had in 2024. And this is like, it's continuing a trend where I already felt this way for Ryziel and Malice, even though I know there's a decent amount of hate for Ryziel and Malice, and I also don't love Malice, but it's still a step forward from what we had in 2024. And I think in general, this sort of thing, I think what you have to understand here is that in game design, you cannot take a full 180 turn from like in overnight from one design to the other. You have to take it a little bit slower, because if you have on the one hand super broken combo stuff or super broken 1-card combos and super broken decks in general, and then on the next day you release some fair stuff, no one's gonna play the fair stuff because the other stuff is just so much better, even at like a nerfed level. Even at a nerfed level, decks like Yubel or Snake Eye or whatever would probably still be better than like a very, very fair and well-designed deck. So you have to take it a little bit slow. You got to go step by step. You got to go like, okay, we're going to release something that's just a little bit more fair and a little bit more balanced than what Tenpai, Snake Eye, and Yubel and whatever was. And then, we go step by step. We do Ryziel and Malice first. And then we throw Blue Eyes in there. we throw Dragon Tail in there and whatnot, and then eventually over the course of time, and like the old decks fade out and get covered on ban lists and all that stuff, and then you improve the game, right? Like, and sometimes that can take a while. Sometimes it can be faster than you would even think. But once again, I said it before, I'll say it again. 2025 Yu-Gi-Oh! Looking so much better for me personally than 2024.
And they've just compartmentalized.
And this is just another iteration of this. Like this is just looking
is better than
fun. You know, I'm
deck.
just looking forward.
So
to
the
this.
original opinion ends up being pretty useful for starting discussions, but a lot of times people don't extrapolate beyond that initial comment, and that's when I think things start getting unproductive. When I say something is good, that just means I think it's worth testing and experimenting with, and I think all the new decks at the moment are.
And it's also worth pointing out that a lot of the things that people are always dooming about is not necessarily gonna happen. You know, people are dooming or were dooming about White Forest as a combo deck, and that is just, it turns out currently in the OCG it's fine. It's part of the metagame, but it's not like taking over. It's not, they're not in a tier 0 combo White Forest format right now. And the same is true for Yummy. Yummy came out, people are dooming about Yummy like crazy, but it's actually not that bad. It's like, it's a solid deck, I'm sure, but it's not taking over like the OCG by storm. And that's like, that's the thing. I still don't think like the new White Forest combo approach is like healthy, but there is also the argument that like combo decks do belong in Yu-Gi-Oh! In some way, shape, or form, right? Because there are people that like them, so there is a place for it, and that's the thing, right? So the deck being part of the metagame but not super like omnipresent, I guess it just has to be fine, you know?
Good in the sense that you should try to push all of these decks. It's not like Crossover Breaker where you play the Yugioh one game and you realize those cards, aside from the field spell, are very bad. So keep testing new decks and then let me know any cool findings or thoughts, because I need to decide on a deck for the city tournament soon. And all I know right now is that I'm probably going to go with Malice or one of the new decks.
All right. Nice little outlook.